I think what's happening is that the Palestinian leadership is putting the European Union in a very difficult position. First of all, you're completely divided as to how to vote in September. You like to vote together.
I'm not asking about the European Union. I'm asking about Israel's place in international law.
But let me explain. This is a much more complex situation than most people think, because the commitment not to unilaterally change the status of the territories prior to the completion of permanent status negotiations was co-signed by the European Union. That puts Britain in a position where if it supports the Palestinians, it's basically working against an agreement it signed.
But the Palestinians
You're in an awkward position.
The Palestinians are saying it's not either or. They're saying they want to restart negotiations with you. They're saying negotiations remain absolutely key. But for example, it's Israel at the moment that is putting this precondition on recognizing Israel as a Jewish state, which is insurmountable to the Palestinians.
First of all, totally untrue. This is not a precondition of the state of Israel. What Israel has said is this: you come to us, you, the world, the Palestinians, and say, recognize the rights of the Palestinian people to a Palestinian state. So 2 years ago, Benjamin Netanyahu, Prime Minister of Israel, stands in Bar Ilan University and says, I recognize the rights of the Palestinian people to a Palestinian state. But he adds something. You should recognize the rights of the Jewish people to a nation state for the Jewish to a nation state for the Jewish people. And for some reason, the Palestinians can't say that.
Because that abrogates the right of return. Now, one can argue about the rights and wrongs of the right of return, the right for Palestinian refugees, please let me finish the question, Palestinian refugees to return to what they consider to be their homeland. But nonetheless, that can be part of the negotiations. You are prejudging the negotiations just as much as you might argue that he saying that it's fine that the UN recognize Palestine on the 1967 borders is prejudging that part of the negotiations.
But let me point out what you're doing. You're asking me as an Israeli to recognize the rights of the Palestinian people to a Palestinian state, but you refuse to allow me to put on the table the rights of the Jewish people to a Jewish nation state. And because of that asymmetry, that's a built-in unfairness. I would think you would
point, Nabil Shaf, that actually the Palestinians do have a problem with the fact that there are now several million Jews living in a place that they consider to be their homeland.
2 states for 2 people. How about that phrase?
We have 2 problems. One about settlements. We never accepted settlements. Settlements is an actual change on the ground. It's a demographic change.
What about Israel itself? Israel within the 1967
but I find it absolutely necessary to say that the term that we had to accept in order to move on the question of the Oslo Agreement was no acts, that no unilateral acts that would change things on the ground.
What about
other than the one he said.
It says change the status of the West Bank and Gaza Strip.
What about the specific point about recognizing that the Jews have a right to self-determination?
It's not a question of the Jews having the right of self-determination. It's the question of all Israelis to have the right of self-determination. Of course, there is a Jewish majority, but there are 22% of Israel is made of Palestinian Christians and Muslims who are Israeli citizens. They are not Jews, and they are part of the Israeli society, and we don't want to jeopardize their future. That's why.
In what way are you suggesting that their future would be jeopardized if you said that Israel should be a Jewish state?
Don't you think?
What do you think suddenly going to happen to them?
Don't you think if I, as a black man in the United States, and somebody insists that you recognize America as a WASP country, a country for white Anglo-Saxon Protestants, wouldn't that really make a Catholic in the United States shiver? I mean, the question is, we recognized Israel in 1993 as a state, as a sovereign state, and we still commit ourselves to recognizing it. To all the Israelis, Israel can decide, but we never asked Israel to recognize us as a Muslim state or even as an Arab state, just as Palestine.
Let me bring this down from the sort of the grand concepts down to the as specific as possible. What do you think is going to happen on the day after this vote? How will things change on the day after this vote?
Well, first of all, we're not really raising the expectations of our people. We're telling them the day after, Israel will not simply leave our country and go away.
Well, what are you planning to do? Are you planning to have mass demonstrations? What are you? Is there going to be a civil disobedience? Is there going to be an Arab Spring?
Not on that day. Not on that day. Believe me, that action is an international non-violent action, and it will be supported with glee and happiness.
Well, it's not going to be supported with glee and happiness by one of your major funders. I mean, the Americans have made it very clear. Congress has
these
written
are not
to you.
part of the Palestinian people. I'm
Yes,
talking about the Palestinian
yes, but
people.
it's you
America
have a responsibility.
is not part of the Palestinian
Understood,
people.
but you have a responsibility to the Palestinian people. This is the reason why I'm asking about what's going to happen on the day after.
Look,
and you have been written to by two senior members of Congress warning that Congress, both houses of which have voted heavily against your move, will cut funding. There is a direct threat that funding will be cut.
I'd be very happy if they use the same with Israel. Say, we will cut your funding if you continue settlement policy. I mean, the Americans cannot be that selective. And I'm not going to really listen to them if that's
so
going to
you're not worried
interfere.
about it? You think it's an empty threat?
That's not the issue. The issue is...
Well, it isn't. Current and future aid will be jeopardized if you abandon the negotiations and continue your current efforts.
If I submit today to the American pressure on this issue by being threatened with money, then I will have to give up everything else in the future. Everything else I want to do, and I think it's part of my right, the Americans say we'll cut the funds. We do not want a battle with them.
What are you going to do, Dore Gold? Are you going to be cutting funds? I mean, you're able to cut funds. You're able to withhold tax revenues.
Well, this is a material breach of the agreement. The agreement originally set up the Palestinian Authority, set up the mechanisms of the Paris Accords, which allow our trade relations. So, you know, if the Palestinians go ahead with a fundamental breach of a core commitment of their agreement, you know, it's a completely open question as to how we respond.
Well, that's why I'm asking you that question. How are you going to respond?
But let me also stress, in addition to this,
how are you going to respond?
You know, we'll have to see. Do we have the draft resolution?
You must be making plans.
Well, we have to make plans. But again,
Avigdor Lieberman, your foreign minister, has said we will withhold tax revenues.
Well,
is that going to happen?
I don't know. We have to see what the actual action is finally taken.
I mean, it's not going to be that long that you have to wait. I mean, do you think that's a sensible move down which to go?
I think that if the agreement is violated so fundamentally, an international agreement that was signed by the European Union, the Russians, the Norwegians, the Egyptians, the Jordanians.
I understand that you think that it's serious if they breach this agreement as far as you're concerned. I'm asking what you will do.
I think we should very carefully study the response. I'll give you a specific.
Well,
I'll give you a specific.
Do you think specifically that you should think about annexing parts of the West Bank?